So good evening, I'm Marcus Hellyer, an analyst here at ASPI. It's been my very, very great pleasure to edit this year's volume that we're launching tonight, Agenda for Change 2019. I'm also going to have the pleasure of chairing tonight's proceedings. So thank you very much for coming out. This week we have very strong competition from the Avalon Air Show. Despite that, we have almost a full house, so it's nice to see that ASPI has the same pulling power as the Joint Strike Fighter. So the first purpose in ASPI's charter is to provide alternative sources of input to government decision-making, and our second is to help nourish public debate. And this publication aims to support both of those purposes. And your presence here tonight confirms that we are fulfilling our charter. So once again, thank you for coming out. This is the third Agenda for Change, which I think makes us eligible for heritage protection in the ACT. It's practically become an institution. But all good institutions need good people to thrive, and I'd like to thank some of the good people here at ASPI who have made this possible. In particular, Steve Clark, our publications manager, who's really an unsung hero, who has helped me wrangle the 31 cats that make up this volume. Also like to thank Larissa Joseph from our strategist team for her last-minute copy editing, and of course Renee Jones and our wonderful events team and our research interns who are helping run tonight's event. So thank you to you all. Good institutions also need to develop over time. So this year we made the decision to change the format somewhat. So we've moved from a small number of longer chapters to a larger number of shorter chapters, each on a particular topic. This means we have 31 essays by 24 authors. I won't run through all of them. You have the table of contents, so you can scan that for yourselves. But you'll see the very broad range of topics we cover, from traditional geostrategic issues to defence policy, to security and human security, to key emergent technologies. And I particularly want to thank all of the contributors. By the time I worked out what we would need to do to get this publication out in time to contribute to the pre-election debate before the election actually happened, I realised I should have started several months earlier. So my poor planning became the contributors' problem, and I want to thank them for their graciousness and good humour in preparing their essays over the summer break. I gave the contributors a rather fixed template, and you'll see that all of the essays follow this template. I was quite dictatorial in asking them to adhere to that. So we see that each essay has three main chunks. The first is quick wins, so the things that the next government can do to quickly signal its intent. The hard yards, which are the things that will require sustained commitment and likely sustained funding. And then finally, breaking the rules. So those outside the box ideas that never really survive the usual policy cycle. What was quite interesting to me was that a number of authors, including myself, said they found it hard to come up with really compelling breaking the rules ideas. So even though we tend to sit around griping about policy and saying, why doesn't the government do something different, when we're actually given the opportunity to come up with something different, it's actually quite hard to do. And so I've been thinking a little about why this is so. And as I say in my foreword to the volume, I think that's partly because in Australia we do have a pretty robust policy-making process. There's many players and many interests, all offering a range of perspectives. So there is contestation and debate. So generally we don't get public policy horribly wrong. But yesterday I spoke at the Chief of Air Force's Defence and Industry Aerospace Conference, and on the topic of innovation. So I've been reading a bit about innovation. And a very interesting volume I came across was by a guy called Clayton Christensen, who wrote one of the seminal works in the field of innovation called The Innovator's Dilemma. And it's based on a study of a number of industry and technology fields in the US in the later 20th century. And Christensen distinguishes between what he calls sustaining innovation and disruptive innovation. So sustaining innovation are the things that good businesses do every day to improve. It's that constant ongoing cycle of continuous improvement. Disruptive innovation are those changes that fundamentally alter your business and potentially kill your business. And the dilemma that he refers to is that good businesses that are well run focus on sustaining innovation, and they're actually very good at it. So good businesses try to meet customers' demand, they try to continually improve, and generally they get good outcomes in the short to medium term. But ultimately in the long term, it still doesn't save them. Okay? Ultimately they're put out of business by disruptive innovations. And Christensen argues that it's very hard to do both at the same time. It's very hard to be good at sustaining innovation while also developing disruptive innovation. And he recommends that if you actually want to foster disruptive innovation, you have to take it out of your core everyday business and essentially quarantine it. And so perhaps it's worth considering that we too in the Canberra policy world are also caught up in a paradigm of sustaining innovation. So we're constantly offering government suggestions to do its current business better, rather than really examining disruptive innovations in the policy space that would fundamentally change the nature of government's business. So I'll leave you with that thought. I would have loved to have had all 24 contributors up here on stage, but I think that might have triggered my earlier cat herding trauma, so we've limited it to 3 panellists. I'll introduce our panellists, put an introductory question to each of them, then open the floor up to questions, and then, of course, it's on to ASPI's world-famous canapes. So I'll keep introductions very short. If you don't know Peter Jennings by now, you haven't really been paying attention. So Peter has been the Director of ASPI for many years now. He was former Deputy Secretary of Strategy in the Department of Defence, and of course you would also know his work from publications such as The Australian. We also have Lisa Sharland. I will read a little bit from Lisa's bio to make a point, and that is, so Lisa is head of the international program at ASPI with research interests in the United Nations and multilateralism, peacekeeping reform, Australia's engagement in UN peacekeeping, African security issues, Australia-Africa engagement, protection of civilians, and women, peace and security. And she wrote on all of them, essentially, for this volume. So Lisa actually gets the prize for the most essays. She did 3, for which I will be always eternally grateful. And also we have Karen Middleton, who did not actually write for this volume. But we've asked Karen to come along because what we have done is essentially provide a bunch of policy recommendations, and we've asked Karen to come along to actually talk about politics. Because one of the key challenges in implementing good policy is understanding the political environment. So Karen is here to offer her insights there. Karen is the Chief Political Correspondent for the weekly national newspaper, the Saturday Paper. She's often a commentator on a number of news programs. She does actually have a background in covering defence issues, so she's been embedded in the ADF in Afghanistan, and she's also the author of a book on the war in Afghanistan, so she's very well qualified to be here tonight. Okay, so I'm going to kick things off with a question to each of our panellists. And the first one is to Peter. And so, Peter, you've provided a framing essay in the collection here, and you outline what you think are 4 of the biggest problems in the defence and security space for the next government. And you've also marked how well the government met the challenges raised in our previous volumes. So I guess if you could briefly outline what are the 4 challenges this time round, and can you predict how well the next government will meet those challenges?
Very, very happy to, Marcus, and good afternoon to you all. Have to apologise for a slightly croaky voice. One of the penalties of working in this line of business is talking too much, so I think my voice will just get through this evening's presentation. I actually wrote two chapters for the book. The second one was on do we need a new defence white paper, and the short answer to that is I've never met a defence white paper that I haven't liked, and yes, I think it will be time for whichever government is elected at the next election to consider starting one, because given the length of time it takes to produce these documents, it will probably be about 2022, 5 years or so since the previous white paper, but I can talk further to that, Marcus, later on if anyone wants. I tried to set a sort of a framing chapter for the book by really making the point that I believe we are in a particularly risky and difficult strategic environment, one which is every bit as challenging to Australian policy settings as the mid-1960s, which I think was really the last point when the challenges of national security were as front and centre in government's thinking. And that led me to say that I think I see four challenges for the next term of office for whoever is in power. The first one is governments are failing us when it comes to being able to sort of tell compelling stories about their policies and why the Australian public should accept those messages. And I've been puzzling for some time to understand why that's the case. Is it connected with social media? Is it connected to the sleep deprivation that I think almost all of our politicians suffer from? But whatever the origins, it is certainly the case that for the last 15 years or so, governments have really failed to be able to get their messages across. And I think partly that is a problem of not being able to locate today's events in the longer term picture of what's driving strategic trends in Australia. So my solution is actually to go back and reinvent a bit of history, to say that the next government should do what John Howard did, which is actually to have 2 strategy cabinet meetings a year designed to focus on the 10 to 15 year framework for Australian policy decision making, and then to locate the day-to-day transactional decisions of cabinet inside that framework. You may think that's pretty simple, but in fact it is remarkable how much of Cabinet's business is about making daily decisions. It's not actually about thinking long term. Second one is about the submarines. And here I think there is a real risk that if a future government is not in a position to explain a compelling case for why Australia is making a $50 billion investment, the largest national infrastructure project in the history of the country. If a government is unable to make that case, then the risk is that the submarine project is going to be dogged with the same sorts of challenges that the Collins submarine project was dogged with, where almost from the start it was identified as a dud sub, very unfairly actually, for what became ultimately a superb combat system. So getting that narrative right is my next big challenge for what I think government should do. Third, China. You would all realise that I think 2019 is emerging as one of the most challenging years from the point of view of the Australian government in terms of setting its policy agenda towards China. And really the essence of that is that for a generation we have benefited from the upside opportunities that have emerged from doing more business with China, more trade, more investment, stronger people-to-people links. Now it's becoming apparent that we have to deal with some of the downside risks from overdependence on one economic relationship. And more than anything else, I think this is going to be a substantial challenge to a future government. My fourth and final recommendation really goes to some of the points that Marcus was making about how hard it is to do deep innovation. And there what I've suggested is that we should government should invest in creating an Australian version of an American thing called the Defence Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA. If you look at what DARPA has done over a 50-year history in the United States, well, it's been responsible for some of the most significant breakthrough military technologies, or indeed dual-use technologies. So think of the internet, think of stealth, think of GPS miniaturisation. To my surprise, I didn't realise quite how small DARPA is. It's an organisation of 200 people. It's primarily involved in contract management with some of the most brilliant minds in the American R&D system. So I've argued in my piece that what we should think about is an Australian DARPA funded to the tune of about $100 million annually, which is looking to those next big technology developments across the military. $100 million is roughly the equivalent of 24 hours worth of defence expenditure on the current budget, so not massive. But they're my four big recommendations. You can look at how I graded how past governments went in terms of dealing with ASPI recommendations from the first two projects. It ranges from A to F in terms of my very quick and utterly subjective grading of those past recommendations. But I encourage you to have a look at that. Thank you.
So thank you. It's interesting, there's a number of themes that recur throughout the volume. Obviously China is one, but actually DARPA is one that occurs a number of times, and maybe that's because we're in the ASPI echo chamber here, but I think there is actually a recognition of a need for sort of fundamental innovation in our defence technology sector. So next question for Lisa, and so 2018 was the year that the Commentariat declared the rules-based global order to be dead. Famous quote now from Alan Gingell, who basically said it's gone, it's over. But to paraphrase Mark Twain, were rumours of its death greatly exaggerated? Is there life in the RBGO yet? And, or to put it another way, should Australia continue to work through multilateral institutions?
Thanks, Marcus. It's a really good question to start on. And I wouldn't want to dispute what Alan Gingell has necessarily said there, but I'd probably say it's in need of a little bit of resuscitation in terms of the way that Australia engages. And I think looking back over the last 70 years in sort of the post-World War II order, we have benefited immensely from what that has produced. And the irony at the moment, and I outline this in the piece I write on multilateralism, is that at a time when we are probably more interconnected than ever in the globe, we're probably less likely to be cooperating on a lot of the challenges that we need to be cooperating on. And indeed, that very tool, that communication platform, is probably something that's being manipulated to exacerbate some of those areas of cooperation. So I thought I'd start by identifying, I guess, four of the challenges that are facing multilateralism at the moment. And it's very interesting to look back on. 10 years ago, I was working at the permanent mission, Australia's permanent mission in New York. And it was 2009, and it was the period where the Obama administration had just come in, and for whatever you think of what the Obama administration did in terms of the US relationship with Australia in the region, it was an area where the US government was really recommitted to the UN and multilateralism and invested a lot of resources in it. So if you switch forward to sort of 10 years later, I think there are a lot of challenges now that we're facing, and a lot of it has to do with the way the US is responding to some of these. So the first one I put out there and I refer to in the piece is around the issue of impunity. And I think we've seen that around a lot of issues to do with human rights. We've seen it, I think, as a stark example very recently with what's happened with a number of the Canadians who have been detained in China, for instance. We've seen that with an Australian academic. And we've seen the importance of there actually being a real vocal response from the international community on this issue. And I think a number of countries, Australia included, has perhaps been quite slow to express that concern. And that impunity extends not just on issues of sort of arbitrary detention of individuals. We see that in terms of the arbitrary detention of a number of the minority population in China, for instance. Again, another issue that doesn't necessarily get a lot of attention. We see it in terms of the number of civilians that are displaced, which is hovering around the most it has been at around 68 million people. We see that in terms of the tragic casualties and consequences, whether it be in Yemen, in terms of what's happening with the displacement in Myanmar, and all these sorts of things. Is that new to the global context? No. But I think one of the challenges is actually mobilising international response to some of these issues. So impunity is one that I would flag, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The second one is this trend of populism and countries turning inward. And it's becoming a real flavour of the month, I think, for leaders, ironically, particularly in democracies, to be focusing very much on the challenges and the divisions within their own borders, and also the threat from outside their borders, and manipulating that in terms of politics within a country. Again, I think that is generating a lot of reluctance to want to cooperate internationally on some of the challenges that we face. Migration, for instance, being a key issue, but there are a number of others. Linked into this, and it goes back to my first point, the third point I'd make was around the US retreat on a number of these issues, in terms of whether it's speaking out against human rights abuses, in terms of whether it's engaging in the UN, multilateral regional fora, in terms of funding to various agencies. We know the UN has withdrawn from the UN Human Rights Council, for instance. So there's very much of an attitude of, we'll just step back, we won't engage and try and reform. And I think that's going to be a real impediment over the next couple of years in terms of whether or not we're in a position to make sure these institutions are adaptable for some of the challenges that we're facing. And then I think finally the fourth point, filling that void, is the increasing role of countries such as China and Russia, who are interested in stepping up their engagement in a number of areas. One of the three pieces that you alluded to that I wrote was about Africa, perhaps an area that rarely comes up in conversations around security in Australia, but it's definitely a continent that's of real interest to China. Russia as well, in terms of investments in mining, but also arms sales and private security in places such as the Central African Republic. So a lot of these countries are getting engaged in spaces where traditionally we haven't been paying attention. And that also has an impact, I think, on the rules-based global order in the long term. In terms of some of the areas that I flagged that might be helpful for a new government or an incoming government around these issues, I think first and foremost, when it comes to our engagement on multilateralism, it is being outspoken on issues or values that we stand quite strongly on, rather than shying away from them. Human rights being a key one there, and we shouldn't be, I think, refraining from calling out the fact that there might be arbitrary detention going on, and we actually don't view that as within our values, and it is actually for us to say something and for the ministers to do so. The second point I'd refer to, and this is the other area in that long list of interests that you referred to, was again this issue of, and related to the issue of human rights, I'll just go back to that for a minute. One of the things that I think is really interesting at the moment is that even for the traditional defence skeptics who think, well, human rights is a bit of a soft issue. It's one of those nice and warm and fuzzy issues that we talk about when we're able to, but when it doesn't converge with our strategic interests, we kind of let it go out the window. But I think we've seen increasingly in areas within our own region, in China, in Myanmar, there is a convergence of interests somewhere in there that we need to be, I think, mapping and mirroring together in terms of our national security policies. So sorry, moving on to the second sort of response. The other issue that I've written a little bit about is our approach to women and women, peace and security. Again, something that does, surprisingly in terms of the Australian government context, as I write in the piece, we've got a really good story to tell on a lot of the work we've been doing. But a lot of that is due to the advocacy of a lot of enthusiasts, a lot of people who see value in the agenda, not so much on the broader national security community seeing value in applying it to their work. And there's a lot of evidence there to suggest that that's key to our engagement in security. You know, we have discussions at the moment around whether women are going to be involved in the negotiations that are happening with the Taliban. And, you know, political expediency probably suggests that may not happen. Again, around discussions on the conflict in Yemen and so on and so on. And often those rights are traded off, that right to participation. Yet we know that this is an important issue in terms of security, and I might come back to that later in our discussion this evening. And then finally, I think how we engage on what have traditionally been referred to as non-traditional security issues, which I think is really a euphemism for security issues we haven't been paying attention to that we really need to pay attention to. Whether it be cyber, whether it be climate, whether it be artificial intelligence, these are all things that are going to require cooperation in the global system. And I think that goes back to your question around the value of multilateralism, and I think that's where Australia will certainly see value in it. It may not be in the format we've had for the last 70 years, and I think we have to accept that, but I don't think that should prevent us from seeing value in it going forward.
Thank you. Yeah, I think another of the themes running, or sort of two parallel themes running through this, is one, we do need sort of more to reinvigorate our defence strategy and perhaps investment. But that doesn't mean we need to withdraw from engaging, proactively with the rest of the world. So.
Absolutely.
And so, Karen, I guess it's no secret that the Australian electorate is, profoundly uninterested in defence and security issues, and all of the surveys tend to indicate that it's very far down their list of priorities. So I guess, we've generated a big list of policy recommendations for the government in the defence and security arena. But of course, any new government will be met with a whole bunch of competing priorities. So I guess the question is, how much latitude and interest will the next government have in grappling with these kinds of issues?
I think whichever side wins the next election, there will be a great deal of interest and focus on our security relationships and our diplomacy. In terms of latitude, I guess I'll come to that. Let's take the two possibilities. If the current government is returned, I would expect that we will see a continuity in what we've already seen in the security space. There's a lot of unfinished business in foreign affairs and trade, but also in security. And I think the government is particularly focused on the China relationship. So we will see a lot of focus on that. If the other side wins the election, there will be, I think, a reluctance to do anything dramatically different in the short term, particularly as it would be a Labor government. And I think Labor is conscious that it has often seen as having less credibility in historical terms on defence and security than a coalition government. So they would be wanting to gently assert themselves in that space. But I think they too would be concerned primarily about the relationship with China. And I think whoever wins, I would expect, as Peter suggests, that we are more likely than not to see another defence white paper, if only for the fact that we've seen a change of Prime Minister and Minister in the current government since the last one. And so you've got a new set of players, the deck chairs have been shuffled again, and so it's possible that a returned government will want to do that. I think an incoming Labor government would want to do that. And we're also going to see, no matter who's in government, a major disruptive event in the form of another US presidential election, whether that is the re-election of President Trump or the election of a Democratic president. I think that will be a disruptive event in security terms because so much is riding on it, and that might well be an interesting kind of benchmark in the next term of an Australian government, because I suspect our government will sort of have the jitters a bit about what's going to happen, because we could see radically different security policy in the United States, or at least managerially anyway, about the relationships. The issues will remain the same, but how they're handled if there was a change of president would be quite different. So I think that's going to be a big determinant for either government in the short term about how our security policy plays out. I think one of the great challenges for our governments, though, is domestic, and it relates to international relationships, security and foreign affairs. And that is our poor practice of our own democracy. And I think people often focus on that in relation to our domestic circumstances, but it does have a major impact on our place in the international world as well. While our traditional coalition partners forgive us our crazy churn of prime ministers or roll their eyes and kind of go, what are the Australians doing now? Our relationships are not necessarily disrupted, but they are sometimes disrupted significantly with other countries, and I'm thinking particularly of China, where they have a longevity advantage in terms of consistency of policy position in government, and they take the long view. And I don't think it does Australia any good to be churning through prime ministers and re-prosecuting these issues over and over. A lot of the progress in security, in trade as well, is glacial, and we just see ourselves being set back constantly by this churn. And I don't think it's a good advertisement for the practice of democracy, and a number of the essays in the latest issue also talk about that, and the importance of entrenching democracy, particularly in our region where it is fragile in some places. So we're not setting a particularly good example in that regard, and I would say that we would need to improve that. I think if we see a change of government and we see a Labor government, we will see a return to the emphasis on multilateral bodies, because I think Labor has tended to put greater store in those than the Coalition has, particularly in recent years. So I think you would see at least a greater overt emphasis on our participation and in seeking to revitalise some of those multilateral bodies that haven't had a huge amount of emphasis. So that would be my general assessment. I think China will feature for both governments and either side, and then that relationship really needs a reset. I think we've been very busy trying to practice diplomacy with China like the Chinese, rather than being Australian. And I think that's a setback for us as well. I think Australia has a reputation of being plain speaking, of being an honest broker, of messaging clearly, and we are failing to do that on China. We're being confused in our messaging, we're being duplicitous, and it's confusing to other players, but it's confusing to the Australian population as well. And I think on the point of messaging that I think Peter was making earlier, that's a really important thing. Australians have lost faith in their political leaders, and they are switching off, and you do not want to be unable to communicate with your domestic audience when you have very significant security issues afoot in our region and further afield that may need very big decisions made, and a lot of goodwill and a lot of support of the Australian population. And if you have broken trust with your own constituency, and I really think people they either don't believe you or they're switching off. I really think people at this point are switched off to the government, but to politics generally. That's not a great position to be in if you're going to be dealing with dangerous issues, particularly in our region.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree. I mean, if the government's trying to sell a message that the electorate doesn't really want to hear, which is you may need to invest more in defence.
Yep.
If you've lost credibility, it makes it very hard to sell that message.
And they are investing more in defence now, but there's also a reputation in those procurement of being flabby, of being unaccountable, of just throwing money around, of projects being late, and whether that's a fair or unfair reputation, it's the public view, and there really is a lot of work to be done to argue why we need the hardware, why this is future-proofing and building Australia into the future in its own defence, and a lot of people just either don't understand it, aren't interested, or don't understand the rationale for investing that much money.
Yeah, which gets at Peter's point about a compelling narrative for the submarines.
Yeah, and the frigates and all the big projects. Yeah.
Okay, thank you all.